Hello, American Johnson, non-compete. Short video this week. Just wanted to talk very briefly about something that I think is important for us to all talk about. There is discussion on the internet lately about whether or not Karl Marx was a racist, and if he was a racist, whether or not that means Marxism is a racist ideology. There is a meme that has been floating around a lot. I've seen it on Twitter a couple of times now that references a letter that Karl Marx wrote to Engels, actually correspondence between Marx and Engels in 1862. There's also, I know of correspondence where Marx used racial slurs, referred to Mexicans as lazy. There's a lot of shitty things that Marx has said about race in his lifetime. He was a Jewish man, a white Jewish man, but he did say anti-Semitic things as well. He lived in a time when racism pervaded society. There are things to his credit as well. He congratulated Abraham Lincoln in correspondence and said that it was a good thing that he was going to end slavery, for example. The exact quote was that he congratulated Abraham Lincoln on his reelection as the triumphant war cry of your reelection is death to slavery. There are a lot of other, we could go back and forth and we could try to litigate whether or not Marx was a racist. He had a son-in-law who was black, who he seemed to accept in his family, but he also said racist things about that person. So, at the end of the day, I believe that Marx held racist views. I'm gonna be just completely honest. I've also seen people discussing on Twitter whether or not Marx was sexist. Apparently, there's some controversy about the fact that Marx was not one to work a lot. He was ironically, not the breadwinner in the home at all times. His wife would go and work and earn the money, and he would stay at home writing, and also, by some accounts, not working a lot, spending a lot of time sleeping and that sort of thing. And so there's this idea that Marx basically abused that gender role relationship and took advantage of some of the women in his life. The truth is, all of these things happened, over 100 years ago. All these things that are being discussed, and for us to try to litigate now whether or not Marx was a sexist or a racist or prejudiced or bigoted in his time, to me, it seems like a waste of time. I think it's safe to say, given the fact that he lived in the time and the place that he did, he held some racist views. He probably held sexist views. He probably would not have been a fan of the LGBT movement. I don't think most people did back then. That's not excusing it. There were people who did. There were people who knew better back at the time. So, I'm not going to try to make the excuse that it was a different time and nobody knew any better, because there were people that knew better. There's no excuse for it. But I think the question to ask is, what does that mean for us today? What does that mean for Marxism today as an ideology? Is Marxism, by extension, a racist ideology because Marx held racist views? I think it's important to talk about these things, and I don't shy away from it. I think that the fact is Marx wrote these things down himself. He believed these things. Does that mean that he's essentially a racist? Can we essentialize Marx as a racist? Is Marx defined by his racism? I don't think that's the case. I think that there's more to, Marx as a human being than those shitty views that he had that undeniably, unquestionably were bad. Because, yeah, everybody has prejudice. And, in those days, the prejudice was a lot stronger in most people. But even now, I still find myself dismantling racism and sexism, transphobia, homophobia, all kinds of bigotry in my own psyche. So I can't sit here and stand on a pedestal and say, I don't have any of these problems. I've talked a lot on my channel about the problems I've struggled with when it comes to dismantling prejudice in my own mind. And I have the benefit of decades and decades of human hindsight, social hindsight, to where we've learned a lot of lessons that weren't as profoundly or universally learned in the days that Marx was alive. I'm not here to excuse what Marx said or to say that Marx held no racist views. I think what's more important is the question of whether or not Marxism as a philosophy is racist. And to me, I think that, first of all, we can't base the decision to a question like that on Marx as a human being alone. Marx did come up with many of these concepts that Marxism is founded on. Marx developed a lot of the principles of dialectical materialism, dialectical materialist analysis of history, the analysis of capitalism as a mode of production. Marx formed a lot of these concepts initially, but he did not form them in a vacuum, and he's not the only reference we have on these. And these ideas have been picked up and carried forward by a lot of people since then throughout history. I mean, for one thing, back in the 19th century, there was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the very first social scientists in history. And W.E.B. Du Bois was a Marxist and evolved a lot of the concepts that Marx had to take into account things like the chattel slavery in the United States of America and the important role that slavery had in the foundation of capitalism. Du Bois pointed out that capitalism and industrialization could never have grown and evolved if it weren't for slave labor, and specifically slave cotton. The cotton gin was a machine that was developed at the time that allowed the United States of America, in the South especially, to produce a lot of cotton. But ironically, the cotton gin as a machine required a lot of human labor to operate. And the only way to economically make that feasible was with slavery at that time. And that cotton is what was originally exported to England, but then used all across the globe to create the textile industry that capitalism was founded on in its infancy. And Du Bois did an excellent analysis of the early history of capitalism, the history of capitalism since slavery ended, the ways in which capital used racial divisions and what Du Bois referred to as the wages of whiteness to further divide the working class and destroy the union movement that was happening in the South after the Civil War ended and slavery ended. Du Bois, I believe, was an early voice who evolved the concepts of Marx in a very important way that incorporated racial division, racial systemic oppression. I arrive at the feeling that Marx is probably thinking of the working class as the white working class. He didn't really talk about racial analysis at all. He didn't talk about systemic racism. He was very focused on class divisions and class issues that were primarily oriented around white people in white societies. Du Bois began to take systemic racist features of society and integrate, analysis of those features into a Marxist framework. And Du Bois wasn't the last person to do that. Since Du Bois, we've had hundreds and hundreds of people of color around the world advance these ideas and discuss them and evolve them. There are a lot of people who have made important work advancing Marxism to better account for systemic racism and to integrate the ideas of Marxism with the wider Marxist philosophy. And I think this is where, reactionaries, right-wingers, they can't understand this because they can't wrap their head around the idea that Marxism is not a cult of personality. We don't worship Marx. Marx is not a religious prophet. Marx was a human being and had flaws and failures and bad ideas. And a lot of those bad ideas revolved around race. Yeah, we call it Marxism because Marx was foundational in building the overall framework of class analysis, class warfare, and realizing the destructive nature of capitalism. But Marx is by no means the only figure who has had a hand in this philosophy. He kind of set the ball rolling in some ways, but certainly it's been picked up and carried forward by many, many, many people throughout history ever since. I think we need to make it clear that today, in 2020, the left, communists, anarchists, Marxists, we do take systemic racism very seriously. And one of the reasons that we should have solidarity with Black Lives Matter is simply because Black lives matter. They have intrinsic value. those values should absolutely line up with our movement, because the reason that we are communists, the reason that we are Marxists, is because we believe that every human being should be valued in society equally. So that's kind of all I wanted to say. I'm going to give Luna an opportunity to speak now, because she is a person of color. And I think it's important to get, as broad and diverse of a spectrum of opinions on this as possible. So here's Luna. Let's hear what she has to say.
Hi, I'm Luna, and I'm speaking as a Vietnamese Marxist. Recently, I've been seeing a lot of people say that because Marx was racist, that's why Marxism is not worth consideration. Yes, Marx was racist, but it doesn't affect Marxism at all, because Marxism is all about dialectical materialism. It's all about dialectical thinking, and basically, dialectical thinking means you should not essentialize anybody. You should judge things based on their own merits. And also, Marx was not the only person who has created Marxism. There were Engels, there were Lenin, there were Ho Chi Minh, and many other people who contributed to Marxism. Ho Chi Minh was our great leader, and he was a very famous Marxist-Leninist. When he was young, before he was even a communist, he came to Paris in 1917, and the reason why he chose Marxism was that at that time the Marxists were the only people who talk about colonialism. Ho Chi Minh read everything about Marx, and he must have known that Marx was racist. But he also knew that Marxism is not a racist philosophy. The purpose of Marxism is to free humans, is to free people of all races. In 1930s, Ho Chi Minh brought Marxism to Vietnam to try to liberate our country. Maybe Marx was racist, but if it were not for Marx's ideas, my country would still be enslaved by the French. What's important to me is not whether or not Marx is racist. What's important to me is whether Marxists are racist. Nowadays, there are millions of Marxists and Leninists all over the world, and most of us are not white. That's why all of Marxists and Leninists should support the Black Lives Matter, because everybody should be equal. I understand if Marx's racism makes you feel uncomfortable. I, as a person of color, I do feel uncomfortable when I read the racist thing that he wrote. But it's the fact that Vietnam was liberated by Marxism, and Marxism is a force of liberation. Marx was the very first person who created Marxism, but Marxism keeps evolving even after he died. A lot of Marxists and Leninists all over the world have been trying to develop Marxism until this day. So it is very important for all Marxists and Leninists all over the world today to keep doing the same thing. We have to strengthen all the strong points that it has and have to fix all the problems that it might have.
Thanks, Luna. So obviously there's a lot more that needs to be said about this stuff. I don't expect you to take my word for everything. It's a complicated subject. I hope you'll do your own research. I hope you'll look into the things that Luna said about her experiences as a Vietnamese Marxist. But ultimately, I'm comfortable calling myself a Marxist. I know that Marxism has lifted a lot of people, including people of color, up to a higher status in the world. It has ended colonization in many places around the world. And there are Marxists today all around the world who are struggling and fighting for liberation. I know that Marxism is an ideology rooted at its very foundation in equality. Even if Marx himself didn't understand or embrace the ideas of racial equality in the way that I do and the way that most Marxists do today, I think that ideological foundation has enabled in a lot of ways and paved the way for a lot of analysis of systemic racism. I think that Dubois was able in a lot of ways to take what Marx said and that foundation that Marx built and build it up even higher to take systemic racism into account. And Marxists ever since have been doing the same thing and trying to carry forward the foundation that all workers around the world, all people around the world should be equal, but try to take the lessons that we've learned throughout history and update those ideas. I think this is a discussion we're going to need to keep having, for a long time to come. But at the end of the day, to me, Marx is an ideology of liberation. It is a component of my ideology that I find very important. I think that his critique of capital was foundational, and I think that dismantling capitalism is going to be necessary if we want to also dismantle white supremacism and all the other forms of bigotry out there. Because in our current society, those forms of oppression they get their power from capitalism. So that's not to say that if we get rid of capitalism, racism and all other forms of oppression will just disappear. I don't believe that. But I do believe that one of the steps that needs to be taken to get rid of all forms of bigotry is to get rid of capitalism, because capitalism exacerbates bigotry. It divides the working class. We have to get rid of capitalism, I believe, if we want to fight racism. And we have to fight racism if we want to get rid of capitalism. Those things are part and parcel in my mind. So do I wish that Marx were not a racist? Absolutely. Did Marx say things that I wish he never said? Absolutely. But facts are the facts. The history is the history. It is what it is. We have to learn to face those things, acknowledge them, and yet still carry forward and advance our liberation struggle today the best that we can, and hope that future generations look back at us and don't think that we're assholes. If you are Black or a person of color and you are also a Marxist or a communist, an anarchist, or any kind of anti-capitalist or radical left-oriented activist, get in touch with me. I'll put my email address in the description. I'm hoping to put together kind of a little compilation of viewpoints and perspectives on this very topic in a future video. And yeah, if you have a channel or any kind of social media or project you'd like to promote, we'd be happy to help you with that as well. But yeah, it'd be great to hear different perspectives. Maybe we can do some live streams, that sort of thing. I certainly, as a white person, don't want to be promoting myself as like the resource for information on this. I'm just giving my opinion. Luna wanted to share her thoughts, but obviously we need to be listening to Black voices and people of color, Indigenous people, when it comes to this stuff, because it's important, obviously, to get as broad of an array of opinions and perspectives as possible so that we can find truth and move forward. And while we're on the subject, I'd like to introduce you to another channel that I've discovered, and I'm actually working with this creator on an upcoming video on police abolition. This channel is called KarKar, K-A-R. It's a great channel. It's run by a Black anarchist who is a political commentator, and really great perspective. It's a new channel. It's like a month old, but already pushing on 2,000 subscribers, and well deserved. I think it's it's a great channel with great voice. And there's a great video on there's a lot of videos on the recent protests and the Black Lives Matter movement.
As a new, younger generation of wealthy white professionals start moving back to the city and the downtown area and the central districts, we are watching stadiums and music venues and big citywide entertainment events take place while the Black community again gets left behind. They are still being put out of their homes. They are still being killed at the hands of the police.
Great channel. Check it out. Give it a subscribe. So that's all I got to say. I'm American Johnson. This is Non-Compete. And if you want to check out Luna's channel, her link is in the description as well, youtube.com/LunaOy. Thank you so much for watching. Take care of each other. Be safe, and solidarity.
Ever hear of Karl Marx? In his mind, communism was born more than 100 years ago. He looked at the world and saw men as divided into two classes, workers and capitalists. In the Communist Manifesto, he called upon the workers, the proletarians, to rise up and overthrow their capitalistic masters. He cried, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite." This was the promise and the challenge of communism.
So let's examine the structure of American capitalism. There are three great pillars. The first and foremost of these is, who can tell us? All right, Louise.
Isn't it the principle of private ownership of property?
Yes, it is. This principle of private ownership is undoubtedly the most fundamental element in the structure of American capitalism. Consider, for instance, home ownership, which is a bright American goal for most of our people. The desire to own one's own home, one's own property, provides a real incentive for almost all Americans to bring out their most productive efforts.
Oh, oh, oh.